Okay, I'm going to do the same thing we did last spring. This is part 2. We started this last spring, so I'm going to go through the same exercise. How many of y'all were born somewhere between 1945 and 1964? Okay, so we got some baby boomers in here. Okay, now 1964 to approximately 1980, 1981. Okay, so we got some Gen Xers in here. And then 1981 to about 1999. Okay, so we've got at least one millennial. And then our Gen Z group would be those born after 1999. So these are students that are in high school now, and they're also students that are presently in college. So, even some of the first wave of Gen Z, they're just now getting out of college. And so we're having opportunity to work with some of them and meet with some of them in the workforce, which I'll tell you all a little bit about because I encountered some of that even last week, getting to actually work with some of my first Gen Zers. So I think y'all are fully aware that there's real challenges in communicating among generations. Of course, obviously I feel that every Sunday. Sometimes, some Sundays I prepare, I think, okay, which generation do I want to offend this Sunday? In terms of just language choice, the type of illustrations you're going to use, the manner in which you communicate, it's a real challenge. So I thought I would begin. This was a story that actually came out in the Christian Chronicle yesterday, so it's hot off the press. And I thought it was a moving story that shows that the generation gulf, as I've heard it referred to, there can be meaningful cross-generational relationships on so many different levels. So I'm of a mind, I want to have friends that are Gen Z students, Gen Z members of Gen Z. I do have lots of millennial friends because I learned things from them, so I hope maybe they benefit from me. So this was the title of this article is, and I'm just going to read some brief excerpts from it. It's pretty long. God's hand in an unlikely kidney donation. Desperate to save a beloved older Christian, a North Carolina church ran an ad asking for a volunteer. A young woman hundreds of miles away responded. Sam Birmingham needed a kidney. His life itself depended on it. Birmingham, 78, father of 4, grandfather of 13, and a U.S. Coast Guard veterans, desperate need of this kidney. So they ran an ad in the Christian Chronicle. The church that he worshiped at ran an ad. Have you ever heard of such a thing that this guy, we're appealing to other Christians who are reading the Christian Chronicle, that this guy needs a kidney. So when the ad ran, Melissa McFerrin, age 30, at the time was living in Searcy, Arkansas, roughly 1,000 miles west of New Bern, North Carolina, where he lived. And her quote was, in reference when she saw the article, she said, really the only way I can describe it is that God pricked my heart that this was something I could help with. I had a brother in Christ in need, and I've been blessed with good health all my life. He needed something that I could give. Okay, 30 years old, so she is a millennial. She's probably born, she's the same age as our middle son, so she's probably born around 1992. Currently, there are 90,000 people on the national transplant list for a donor kidney. McFerrin said, I had all kinds of blood tests, an MRI, EKG, chest x-ray. They did 12 vials of blood, doing all this screening to see that if she could actually donate her kidney. So she and her husband actually, before her surgery occurred, had moved to the Nashville area. So the surgery occurred at Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Nashville, and then her kidney was flown to North Carolina for Birmingham's transplant. She returned to work a week after the surgery. Can you imagine that? That's major surgery. And so just one last quote from her. They've talked on the phone, she and the recipient of the kidney. He's done really well. They FaceTime, but they have not met in person just yet. She says, the story is not about us, but about the love and prayer of a Christian family who have walked beside us, and about God who orchestrated it all. Maybe our experience with its amazing blessings on both sides will encourage another to listen to God's promptings in his or her heart and change someone's life forever. So it's a great example of, this is somebody, these were 2 generations came together, 78 years old. He's not a baby boomer. He's going to fall in the category of being this part of the silent generation, which silent generation are obviously aging. and she's a millennial, and these two generations came together in such a meaningful way, actually, to save somebody's life. So I think it's a great story. So I hope I have a teenager in my house. So just out of curiosity, how many actually have teenagers in your house right now? Okay, bless you. Things are changing, and as I mentioned last spring, those of us who raised children and had teens in our house several years ago, I think things have changed even since last year. I think things are changing that fast, and you're fully aware of that fact. So last spring, what I did was some Generation Z realities. We just did a lot of looking at statistics, looking at some trends, looking at things like depression in teens, anxiety in teens, even suicide rates among teens, things that serious. So we just kind of did some diagnosis. What are the trends? So what we're going to do now is, what can we do to equip our children? I hate to just be in the position of being the message of doom and gloom. This is horrible and this is terrible, because I don't think that's true. I think these kids have a lot to offer, and obviously we want to do the best we can to equip them to be servants of God and to equip them for real life as they live in a world that's changing so quick. Okay, this is going to be a generational test. How many of y'all remember the commercials? You've got peanut butter in my chocolate. Y'all remember that? Y'all remember those? Okay, I think you would. You're not supposed to. Okay, it's a Reese's peanut butter cup commercial. It first appeared in 1972, so that's been 50 years. They continued that ad campaign even into the 80s. I looked up Reese's peanut butter cups today. You have any idea how much the Hershey Company grosses in Reese's peanut butter cup sales in a year? About $2 billion a year in Reese's peanut butter cup sales. So this was a great ad campaign that started in 1972. It was very successful. And so kind of the way the commercials would go, you'd have these two random people that literally bumped into each other, and he would get his chocolate and somebody's peanut butter, and mix them together, you got Reese's peanut butter cups, and it was very, very successful. So, in a work scenario, some baby boomer made reference to that commercial, that ad campaign, to a millennial, and this is how it worked out. A 20-something thought he was making a sexually charged comment, okay? Because she wasn't aware of the ad campaign, so she took it very differently. Talking about a breakdown in communication. So it went all the way up to HR. They're working for some company, it went all the way to HR. And even the HR person had not heard of the commercial. So, think, I'm 60 years old. I was 10 years old when those commercials came out, so I'm on the young end. So what the HR person told this guy, you should not use older sayings that no one understands. Okay, so I think his reaction was, culture or history did not begin when I came into the world. So then the natural question is, should younger people refrain from using phrases members of the older generation do not understand? So do y'all know younger people that use phrases and you have no idea what it means? I'm embarrassed. I had somebody text me something the other day. It's one of these, abbreviations. I didn't know what it meant. I had to Google it, and when I Googled it, I found out, oh, that's what it means. I was embarrassed. I wasn't about to tell them that I didn't know. Oh yes, of course, So communication's a challenge, and communication is a challenge to the sense that here was a great ad campaign. It was clever, and it really served Reese's peanut cup very well. And this young millennial or Gen Z person thought they were making a sexually charged comment. It goes all the way up to HR. So, thank you to one of our esteemed class members who gave me the suggestion of reading the book entitled The Coddling of the American Mind. It's not an easy read. There'll be some things that'll make you cringe, but it's a really, really good book. If I'm not mistaken, it's co-written by an attorney and a person who has a background in sociology. And so they've teamed up together. The sociologist has done the number crunching and the research on social trends, and the attorney brings what attorneys bring to the table. So the blend of these two guys, right? Is that true? The blend of these two guys is really brilliant. I mean, the book is very, very good. So a lot of what I'm going to talk about, at least for the next couple of weeks, is going to be rooted in this book. The other resource that y'all may want to read that I found really good is entitled Generation Z Unfiltered. It's written by Tim Elmore. I've actually listened to another one of Elmore's books on leadership earlier this year on an audio book, and it's very good as well. If you're familiar with John Maxwell, Elmore worked with the John Maxwell organization for a long time, and now he's broken off on his own. Also follow him on Instagram. Elmore has a really good Instagram account that's worth following, so I recommend following him on Instagram.
What was the author on that one?
Elmore, E-L-M-O-R-E.
Thank you.
And he's coming from a Christian viewpoint. I wouldn't characterize this as an overtly Christian book, but that's definitely the viewpoint that he's coming from. So you'll find him engaging, and he really is good. The Calling of the American Mind is just plow in and plow up. I mean, it's just pretty hardcore stuff. So the first thing he talks about is the untruth of fragility. And these are the two authors here. They look like German names, possibly. I can pronounce Spanish really well, but not other languages. I looked at this passage in a sermon a couple weeks ago, James chapter 1, 2 through 4. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know the testing of your faith develops perseverance, produces perseverance, let perseverance finish its work, so be mature and complete, not lacking anything. Do we believe that? Do we believe that's true? At the end of the day, if we're being serious,
Yes.
we're not a Sunday school answer. We're being serious. Do we believe this?
Yeah, we
Because
don't
this
act
is.
like it sometimes.
I'm sorry.
We don't act like it sometimes.
We don't act like it sometimes. I agree with that.
We want to always be comfortable.
Okay. We do enjoy our comfort, do we not? But at the end of the day, the principle of trials refine us and cultivate perseverance, or cultivate our ability to endure. And the final consequence is we'll be mature Christians. We'll be mature in our faith. So I think in theory, we say, yes, I believe this, but sometimes when it comes to our own life, and especially dealing with our children, we act like this passage doesn't exist. So that's why I want to use this as a foundational passage, because I think it's really important that we have to say, if my child is experiencing some kind of trial, as difficult as it is to watch, it may not be all bad, because they're going to have to learn some hard lessons. When our oldest son moved to Los Angeles, I said, great, if you want to do that, you've got these grandiose plans, but I'm not going to pay for it. You're going to pay your own way. And I know there were some pretty thin times for him, and it took everything I had not to send him money, because, I thought, he could sure use a couple $100 to help with some groceries, and I just didn't do it. I just had to discipline myself not to do it. Let him go and eat some ramen noodles. It won't hurt. He'll be okay. But it sure wasn't easy to not do that. So why these lessons and why now? So I want to come back to this passage again and again, where he says, in view of God's mercy, offer your bodies as living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. I think our objective in this class, this go-around, that we want to do everything we can to equip our own children and grandchildren to be able to live transformed lives, to not just become conformed to the culture that we live in today, where they're truly unique, that they stand out. And to have just a little fun with the passage, I have it from the Message, and this is really pretty cool. So here's what I want you to do, God helping you take your everyday, ordinary life, your sleeping, eating, going to work, and walking around life, and place it before God as an offering. Embracing what God does for you is the best thing you can do for Him. Don't become so well adjusted to your culture that you fit into it without even thinking. Instead, fix your attention on God. You'll be changed from the inside out. Readily recognize what He wants from you and quickly respond to it. Unlike the culture around you always dragging you down to its level of immaturity, God brings the best out of you, develops well-formed maturity in you. That's, I mean, I realize the message is it's not a real translation, it's more of a transliteration is what it's referred to, but nevertheless, the language in this passage really is vivid, and it brings a certain degree of appreciation for the text that you don't get from the regular translation. So, isn't that true for our kids? Don't we want our kids to think they are not conformed and just little copycats of the culture they're living in, that they can rise above that because we're servants of God? Unfortunately, I think that is a real losing battle in many ways. It's a real challenge. I think we're challenged in ways I've never seen before, at least during the course of my career. I think it's extremely, extremely difficult. But I'm not ready to punt. Are y'all ready to punt? I'm not ready to just punt. And I feel responsibility for your children just like I did for mine. I'm not ready to just sit back and watch the world go by. So this is what we're going to cover tonight. The untruth of fragility. What doesn't kill you makes you weaker. So growing up, what did y'all hear? Did y'all hear that quote like that? What doesn't kill you makes you weaker?
No, it makes you stronger.
That's the way we've always heard it. Isn't that correct? Whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So these two authors are arguing the point that parents of Gen Z children are flipping that quote and saying, what doesn't kill you makes you weaker, not stronger. So in other words, they clarify that by saying teaching kids that failures, insults, and painful experiences will do lasting damage is harmful in and of itself. Human beings need physical and mental challenges and stressors, or we deteriorate. So in other words, the idea that we're going to protect our children from failures, insults, and painful experiences. So I have one friend I'm thinking of who has a child that started first grade this fall. Do you think a child in first grade is going to experience some insults and painful experiences? Kind of think so. I think they will in first grade. Kids can be mean in first grade. So that's certainly a possibility. And can you completely protect them from all of that? I don't think you can. You might try. But what these authors are pointing out, should we? Should we go on and allow them to experience a little bit of taste of real world? Now, I'm not saying to be capricious or not being protective of our children in inappropriate ways. I think there's a fine line. I'm not going to feed my kids to the wolves, so to speak, but at the same time, that's part of life. So this idea that we're just going to protect them from everything to the point that they don't have good coping skills and they're no longer resilient. The point is that mental challenges and physical challenges and stressors, it actually challenges us. Go back to James 1:2-4, that it's actually good for us. Whose favorite years in school were middle school? I've never heard anybody say, oh, my favorite years in school were 6th and 7th or 8th grade. Nobody said that. In fact, there was a lady at church when we lived in Muleshoe that said, if the Lord decided that she was not going to go to heaven, instead he was going to send her back to middle school. And I think there's a grain of truth to that. That's not your favorite time, but yet at the same time, there's probably some lessons we learned in middle school that were pretty important. When I was in 7th grade, we still lived in Wisconsin, and it was 1974, and the Supreme Court had said that schools are going to have to be integrated. And so I went to a predominantly white school, and they're busing in a number of black students for the first year. 7th grade, the first year to do this. So the school was probably nearly almost half and half, racially speaking. And as a 7th grader, 7th graders, they're all just thinking about themselves. It is that concept to put them in a barrel and seal it up and then open it up, a few years later. 7th graders are 7th graders. But I look back on that now and I realize I learned some really hard, valuable lessons by being the first year of racial integration. I learned some cultural lessons. I didn't know it at the time. And I look back on that now and I think it never occurred to me as a 7th grader to look at that experience through a black student who's being bused from the other side of town into an all-white, fairly affluent school. I never looked at it from eyes of empathy. I do now, but I didn't as a 7th grader, but learned some valuable lessons. And so if my mom had swooped down and say, oh, you little darling, we're gonna ship you off somewhere else so you don't have to experience this horrible experience of integration, which my mother, being raised in the South and having a little bit of racist tendency, she might have done something like that. So I'm glad she didn't, because I think as painful as 7th grade was, I think it was probably my worst year in school. I still look back at that and I learned some lessons.
So you must have been sheltered if you didn't see it till 74, because a bunch of us lived in the 60s.
Right, which is even different, yes, and probably more challenging in the 60s. We lived in Chicago in the 60s. My dad was a corporate exec with International Harvester. We lived in one of the suburbs of Chicago, and he rode the train to downtown Chicago. We moved to Racine, Wisconsin in 1969, but he was commuting to Racine. We lived in Chicago one more year. He was commuting to Racine in 68, and there were lots of racial riots in the city. And even though I was 6 years old, I barely remember. I remember my mom and dad talking about it and talking about the issues. And what's interesting growing up, my dad's viewpoint on that versus my mom's. My dad was far more open-minded. My mother was old school Southern racist. She said she wasn't, but she was. I probably told y'all a story when we lived in Lubbock, and I think I was either already in college or maybe a senior in high school. And a black lady, moved in across the street from my mom. And I thought, this is the greatest thing that's ever happened, ever. Because George Jefferson is moving across the street from Archie Bunker. This is the greatest thing. I mean, I was just thrilled. I thought, this is funny.
You might have to explain who they were.
Yeah, that's true. Tell you what, if we want to do some generational stuff, let's just watch All in the Family. So my mom and I were out working in the yard one day, and she said in her Southern accent, well, and I thought, oh, here it comes. She noticed that the blacks are taking really nice care of their yard, as if she was surprised. And I said, oh, man, I'm mistaken. I was thinking their name was Johnson. I don't recall their name being black. She said, you may think you're funny, but you're not. You're not really think you are funny. Because she thought she was being really generous by saying that, not saying something else. And I thought she was being racist. And I was kind of pointing it out in sort of a kind of nice way. And she caught it. She got the message, but she did not think I was funny. I thought it was funny. So, which leads to overprotection. So the foolishness of overprotecting is apparent as soon as you understand the concept of anti-fragility, given that risks and stressors are natural, unavoidable parts of life. So here's the illustration I would use. How many of y'all in here remember when your children had their learner's permit at around age 15 and then got their driver's license at 16, maybe 17? Okay, been through that 3 times. Went through it, the oldest one. He got his driver's license at 16. He tore up enough vehicles. I decided with the next 2, I'm going to wait till 17 because that 1 year, especially boys, makes a difference. So when your kids are getting their driver's license and you're setting them off to drive, does it make you uneasy? Made me uneasy. I mean, I'm thinking, what have I done? I'm sending them off. What am I doing? And there's risks and stressors for the parent because there's risks in sending a child out in a vehicle. They're 16 years old. There's crazy people out there that drive in crazy ways. There's people who are driving intoxicated, even in the middle of the day, right here in Granbury. And so that creates fear. Then I came to the conclusion, do I want my kids to ride with their friends or do I want them to drive? And I quickly decided, okay, when it comes to risks, I like the idea of, I taught them how to drive. I feel more comfortable because some of their buddies coming by, I'm going with old so-and-so, and even, the older boys, I especially remember, I'm going to ride with my friend, we're going to go to Fort Worth. And I kind of had a little conniption fit. I did not like the idea of them driving to Fort Worth at all. And I think I remember talking to Mike about it at one point. Don't your kids go to Fort Worth when they were 16? You know, how did you deal with this? You know, but that's part of it. But yet I couldn't say, no, you're not gonna get your driver's license, or no, you can't ever ride with your friends. Now, I might be selective about which friends, but I'm gonna go on, I had to go on and let them launch. Again, I waited a year with Daniel and Mitchell because I just thought waiting until 17 was probably a good idea. Now there's a trend in driving. Have y'all picked up on the trend right now? What's the trend in driving with kids? They don't want to get their driver's license. When I was 16, I was chomping at the bit. I was going to downtown Lowell, that DPS office, and I'm gonna parallel park my mother's tuna boat Oldsmobile, and I'm gonna get my driver's license. And I had a little confession to make. I don't know if my kids ever did this. The first night I had my mom's car, it was an Oldsmobile with 455 in it. First night I had it out by myself to go play tennis with my friends. I took it out in the loop and load and opened it up to see how fast it'd go. And I thought, what if my boys ever did stuff like that? So my mom's thinking, you know, stress and risks. She probably knew what she was dealing with. You know, that it was, we did some crazy things. So, but nevertheless, I let my kids do that. Okay, let's take it one more step. You send your kids off to college, and they're gonna live in a dorm. They're not supervised. There's no curfew. Well, maybe there is. They're going to Abilene Christian. In theory, there's a curfew, which students figure out a way to work around. You know, Jan, when she was at Lubbock Christian, was always sneaking out the window. And, you know. So, but they're going to have a lot of independence overnight. Overnight, you're given this independence. So does that make you feel uneasy? Yeah, it made me feel uneasy, you know, but do they need to launch and grow and have some experiences? Now, all three of ours had some bumps during those years and made some poor choices. And I was under the impression, I'm sure I've told all this before, I was so naive. I thought, hey, when they turn 18, I'm kind of done with this deal. This is going to get better. So dumb, that's when it starts. Parenting starts when they turn 18 and they leave home, because you're still parenting, but yet they're 18 and they're not in your home, under your roof, they're somewhere else. And that was, I think that was the greatest challenge of parenting. It was difficult. But nevertheless, you can't just say, no, you can't go to college, you're gonna stay home, and you're gonna stay right here where I can keep the thumbs on you. And I'm gonna let you live at home, and you're gonna have to commute to Stephenville and go to Tarleton. And maybe that's a good choice, but I felt like it was good for the boys to leave home and be away and have to do their own laundry and manage their own money and, you know, do things. So the fragility is ideal. No. So preparation. Prepare the child for the road and not the road for the child. Okay, what do y'all think about that? Don't you want to prepare the child for the road? But yet, conceptually, the point that these guys are trying to make in the calling of the American mind is, it's really common, it's a common mindset among parents of Gen Z students to do it the reverse. As they say, these days we seem to be doing precisely the opposite. We're trying to clear anything away that might upset children, so we are preparing the road for the child. Thus the term snowplow parents. I'm going to plow ahead and pave the way for them where the road is so much easier for them. So have y'all seen that? I know we have some educators in here. How does that play out? What does that look like?
Kid gets in trouble at school and you have the parent conference, and they may have painted the air blue with language, whatever. And so then the parent comes up and says, what did you do to provoke my student to do that?
It's a good example. So,
I've heard it, yeah.
so you're assuming high school age, Kirk? So this is a high school student, say 15, 16, maybe 17 years old, and they're gonna be adults soon. And they get out in the real world, and mom and dad have done that for them. But at some point, that's not gonna fly. You know, they're gonna have to work in a job, that's not gonna fly. That's not gonna work really well.
Well, one thing it does too is I don't think a lot of times parents realize how exhausting that is for themselves to continually do the work for their child. It's doing neither side any favors. The children, teenagers, whatever the age may be, are not going to have any sense of responsibility or owning up to their mistakes, accepting consequences, and the parents are just gonna be exhausted and cranky.
Well, police officers tell me, the ones I work with here tell me that in field training, what their youngest officers are training right now, they're good guys, they're likable guys, they can pass a background check, but they're very, very indecisive and have a hard time making decisions, being confident in making decisions. They're hesitant, really hold back, struggle to some degree, multitasking, things like that. And I think that's a consequence of this kind of thing. We haven't prepared them well. So they can go to a police academy, do real well academically, but when they get out in the field, they're struggling with their field training officer.
You know, I was looking at that, prepare the child for the road and not the road for the child. And growing up, going to school, if I did anything in school, I was guilty. Didn't matter. At home, I was guilty.
Right.
My two kids, I told them the same thing. If something comes back, you're guilty. And my son, when he got his driver's license, well, his learner's permit and driver's license at 16, he was involved in 4 accidents in 1 week. Caused one, passenger in 2 different vehicles, and then got hit by a lady on a Saturday. When my daughter turned 15, that same day, I took her down to the DPS and I got her learner's permit and the workbook. And every day she drove me everywhere, or drove her mom everywhere we needed to go.
And the only way to do that is to drive with them. So I'm gonna equip them to drive. And everything else, I think that's a good term. I'm gonna equip them to be ready to go to college and be independent. Or I'm gonna equip them to be able to show up at a job on time, to work and do what you're supposed to do, and play well with others while you're there. And if you come home whining about who you're working for and the way that's playing out, you know what, you got to suck it up and get over it. You're gonna have to learn that part of the world is dealing with all kinds of people, and that's part of it.
When you turn 18, I joined the military straight out of high school. And you talk about unsupervised kids. Kurt, he knows. You have these 17, 18, 19, 20-year-old kids with no adult supervision at all, except between the hours of 7 and 4:30 or 5 during the day. After that, the world's yours, you know. And we could always tell the ones that were brought up right, because they were
They could function. So that's the
and
goal.
the rest of
One
us in a different story.
Yeah, so you're trying to prepare them for independence, and there's no way that you can possibly prepare the road for your child. How can you possibly anticipate every nuance they're going to experience? It's just impossible. It's never going to work out. So it's really fascinating. No, I never anticipated one of our kids would live overseas in a different culture where they speak a different language, and somehow Mitchell has navigated for 3 years in Beijing where there's a different language. And I don't think I would have done that at that age, but I think that's one good thing is he was a handful. No, I shouldn't say was, he is a handful. But it's exciting to me that'll be an experience living overseas, that he'll take that with him the rest of his life, regardless of what he chooses to do. So, very difficult.
Today, as a school bus driver,
Yes, you're gonna be our great resource.
today's parents make excuses for everything their children do. You know, if they are not out there when we're supposed to pick them up, they called and say, well, we're not off and left their, you know, Johnny or what have you. And our buses are equipped where they can tell where we are at every moment, what speed we're going, and they have, you know, inside, photograph pictures, videos. But the parents, they believe, of course, I believed everything my kids told me when they were little. But we're talking, they make so many excuses for these children. They're not helping them.
So that's, kind of goes back to that's preparing the road
Right.
by excusing and enabling. When I rode the bus, this is seventh grade too, this is one of my favorite seventh grade memories. I was on the bus and this kid I didn't like wanted to sit next to me. And I told him, you're not gonna sit here, if you try to sit there, I'm gonna punch you. And so he went and sat somewhere else, and the bus driver came up to me and she put a fist in my face and she said, you don't let him sit there, I'm gonna punch you. And I thought, she would not get away with that today. And I just sucked it up and like, oh well, I've never even told my mom. I was like, whatever, you know, I probably shouldn't have said that. I think I was mad, you know, I didn't appreciate it at the time, but I probably
Well,
think
today
it's,
they tell their mom, so mom will call the school and we'll have to, as a bus driver, you have to go in and they have to look at your tapes to see that you didn't do what the kids told the mom.
so it's hard, I think, and I'm not, you know, being a parent for Gen Z kids, it's not easy. And I think it's hard, especially if you're at a crisis moment with your child, to navigate and make all the right decisions. It's just hard. So, but I'm trying to give us a little foundation to think, even in moments of crisis, to think more big picture. What am I really trying to accomplish? What do I hope that, you know, how do I hope my child will be able to function in the real world? And how can my child be God's servant who's unselfish and thinks of other people and is not narcissistic and just totally into themselves and always think that they're right? That's a big narcissism. It's not so much selfishness as it is, I'm always right and nobody's ever wrong. And do you want to foster cultivating that kind of mentality among your child? Protecting our children, a big question mark. If we protect our children from various classes of potentially unsettling experiences, we'll make it far more likely that those children will be unable to cope with such events when they leave our protected umbrella. The modern obsession with protecting young people from feeling quote-unquote unsafe is, we believe, to be one of several causes of the rapid rise in rates of adolescent depression, anxiety, and suicide. Now, I believe he's correct, it's one of several. I don't think this is the only reason. I think there's several other contributing factors to anxiety and depression and even suicide rates being on the rise. And by the way, they're way on the rise. The statistics are overwhelming on all three areas. But the idea of, I don't want my child to have any upsetting experiences, and I don't ever want them to feel unsafe. Now, I realize there's a fine line here. And so I think we do have to protect our children from truly unsafe situations. Now, we're defining that, so where I guess it gets complex. I don't want my children to be potentially harmed physically or emotionally or even sexually. I don't want them harmed. But at the same time, they're gonna have to live in the real world. The real world is the real world, and you know, if your kids, whether in public schools or even a private school, you're gonna meet all kinds of other kids, you're gonna be exposed to all kinds of things. And you can't really put them in a bubble. And I think sometimes the term of that feeling unsafe, I feel unsafe, I hear that a lot. I hear that language more and more among younger people. I just don't feel safe. And you're kind of like, really? You know, it's
Because
usually
I think
something.
unsafe now means I didn't like it.
Correct, that's, okay,
I
that's
disagree with
stated
you.
well,
Yeah.
okay, that's good. Feeling unsafe is I didn't like it, they're gonna get into this a little more in detail, but that's correct. Which I look unsafe, I think, I'm really unsafe. There's some, maybe I would use the word threatened, I feel threatened. I'm unsafe in the sense I feel threatened.
Perhaps that's a pendulum swing from the healthy expression of, yes, if you're feeling unsafe, you should be able to express that. However, maybe we've taken it too far, and this is the end result.
my older boys used to scare their youngest brother. They would tell him, stranger danger, Mitchell. They would tell him all this stuff that's going to happen to him, which is really funny. That wasn't really funny at the time, but it's a little funny then too. But brothers picking on him, which probably made him why he's pretty resilient, because his brothers terrorized him while he was growing up. So it is, I think the language that these two authors are using, it's a modern obsession. I think it's true. I think it's pretty commonplace that I don't want my child to feel unsafe. I don't want to get ahead of myself. He's going to take it a step further. The meaning of safety. So these two guys would say, gradually in the 21st century on some college campuses, the meaning of safety underwent a process of concept creep and expanded to include emotional safety. As an example, in 2014, Oberlin College posted guidelines for faculty, urging them to use trigger warnings to show students you care about their safety. Okay, so I've taught in 4 different universities on a part-time basis since 1987. And I think about the subjects I've taught. Most recently, I've taught psychology classes for undergraduate students. I'm thinking, in a psychology class, you're potentially dealing with sensitive subjects. Like, for example, if I'm teaching personality theory, I'm going to talk about personality disorders like narcissistic personality disorder, borderline personality disorder. Well, that stuff that could definitely, that's getting into some pretty intense material. That could, I'm not sure that teaching college algebra is going to trigger anybody. It might, I don't know. But the social sciences, even in history, you could bring up subjects in history that a student could potentially say, well, that's triggering to me. I don't want you to talk about that. And so they're telling the faculty, you have to warn them. Now here's trigger warning. I had never heard that phrase until the last couple of years. That, I'm going to issue a trigger warning before I mention X, Y, Z. And so you're protecting these students. So what I think the consequence of that is, and y'all can disagree, but I think the consequence is that we're not fostering critical thinking. That they've got to be able to think critically. A child has got to learn to think through things and draw their own conclusions. And that means they may hear some things in a class they don't necessarily agree with. I had a biology professor when I was at Tech, and I agree with a lot of things that guy said. But I would just sit there and think through it. I was 18, I wasn't the brightest bulb on the string by any stretch of the imagination. But I'd think through it, and I'd go home and think, hey, that's just not right. That's so off base. And what about my way? Whereas now a parent might say, oh, he shouldn't be saying that in biology class. Well, I think it was good for me to think about what I believed and what I thought was true, and use critical thinking skills. So their point, one of the key themes in this book is what's going on college campuses. And I think that's really significant because Gen Z students are obviously flooding college campuses right now, especially resident students that are living on campus. Okay, I'm gonna go through this real quick. This is a DSM-5 definition of not just trauma, but post-traumatic stress disorder. It's pretty complicated, and it's extreme. If somebody really has diagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder, the only reason I'm putting it up here, I just simply want us to see the complexity of it. And I'm only including half of it. I'm putting half the material up here. I'm not even, just to give you an inkling. So I'm not going to spend any time on that really, just to give you an idea. A diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder is very, very serious. And you're going to have some serious symptoms that indicate the presence of PTSD. So these two authors are saying we're redefining trauma now. By the early 2000s, the concept of trauma within parts of the therapeutic community had crept down so far that it included anything experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful with lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning and mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So the subjective experience of harm became definitional in assessing trauma. In other words, subjective meaning, if I say it was trauma to me, it is. It's gospel truth. So if somebody says, John's sermon Sunday morning caused me trauma, which probably caused a lot of people trauma, but then It is so. The sermon Sunday morning calls me trauma. It is so, because it's your subjective definition. The DSM-5 has objective criteria, and I'm doing it in contrast for post-traumatic stress disorder. There is objective criteria. You've experienced something so significant, so traumatizing, a major crisis, and in some cases maybe ongoing. For example, people who have been in battle in a military setting, that it really is a major event in your life. So now they're saying that, and I don't know about y'all, I hear this all the time now. I just feel traumatized. I just feel traumatized by this and this. You're like, do what? And it's working through that and getting it. I think students are pretty brainwashed on this front, that everything causes trauma, that I can define it. I dealt with an unpleasant teacher that was not very nice to me. Did y'all ever have any unpleasant teachers that were nice to you? I sure did. I had a 5th grade teacher. I think she definitely caused me trauma. She talked ugly to me, so that's causing me trauma. Man, how are you going to function in life? Because in the real world, there's difficult people that are just not always pleasant to deal with. Have y'all heard that? Do y'all hear that kind of language? I hear it frequently.
So is this, what you're saying, is that kind of along the same lines of with some people, perception is reality?
Yes, exactly, it's what it is.
Yeah.
That your definition of trauma is based on it's kind of like you can define trauma however you want to define trauma. Now, I'm not making fun of somebody's traumatic experience, because people really have experienced. I've worked, the field I've worked in all these years, I've worked with people who really have had, the real deal. I worked a call to PD years ago here in Granbury. 18-year-old girl came home and found her dad deceased in the home. She's 18. That's traumatic. That's very traumatic. And he'd been deceased in there for several days. So I felt for that girl that night. I think that's traumatic. Now here I am, I'm being subjective. Give me my definition. Somewhere you're crossing a line, and I think we've just moved the line where you can look at me wrong, and I've been traumatized because you looked at me wrong. So I would just encourage us as parents not to let our kids are going to hear that. They're going to hear that language a lot among their peers, and they're going to have that kind of exposure. And that's going to be I think it's going to be a challenge. I feel traumatized. So the question these guys pose, is trauma a subjective experience? It is not for anyone else to decide what counted as trauma, bullying, or abuse. They don't like that to you. Trust their feelings. If a person reported that an event was traumatic or bullying or abusive, his or her subjective assessment was increasingly taken as sufficient evidence. Now, I'm not a proponent. I'm not saying we should tolerate bullying in a school setting, but how we define, am I being bullied, and what really is, there again, it's a fine line. I'm not an educator, so not down the K through 12. I realize there's a fine line, but that's tough. What do y'all think?
The kids right now are going, at the middle schools, are going through what they call body shaming. Like, you've got a bubble butt, or, you don't have any boobs, and things like that. When I was growing up, it was teasing. It was just called teasing, and I was 2 toothpicks stuck in an olive. But that was just what it was. But now it's body shaming.
I think it's a little different nowadays because there's a lot of hurt in what kids say and people say. A lot of deliberate goading.
I'm gonna take a picture of this other kid who posted on Snapchat with mean comments by it.
Yeah. 'Cause I think the difference today is social media.
It is social media.
And how it's
just
not
it's-
between two people.
No, now
or a
it's
group.
among hundreds
Right.
potentially.
And that's the way they want it, they put it out there.
Yeah.
One thing that I tell my kids, is that, they come home, you know, from school and say, well, this kid said this and this kid said that. And I said something along the lines of, you know, okay, well, I can understand how that was hurtful or that was an unpleasant experience. But also reminding them at the same time that they are all at an age where they're still learning where those boundaries are.
That's a
between
good point.
teasing and more than teasing. And that, at the very least, we ought to give each other some grace. And also trying to understand what's going on with this person at home. Like, you have no idea what they may be dealing with. Not to give that person an excuse, not to give them a free pass. I just wanna make my kids think about the bigger picture and think through some of the possibilities so that it allows them to have some empathy, but also talking through, okay, well, how could you respond to that? So that they also develop some toughness. I'm not gonna go in there and fix it for them. They're gonna continue to have to deal with it, but trying to kinda attack it from both angles, if that makes sense.
I think that encourages the cultivation of empathy, which is really important. It helps them see, well, where are they coming from, and not that they should put up with things, it's hard, it's really hard. But you're right, I think social media it's fueled it. And it's even more complex than it was 5 years ago. It's because the platforms are changing, the platforms are becoming more complex. You know, Snapchat and TikTok, stuff like that, and other apps that I'm not even familiar
And
with.
you want those likes to pile up on.
Right, and so I can post an unfavorable picture of somebody, and my friends, I think my friends like that. And so the insult is way up. So I wouldn't want to experience that as a kid. It's not helpful.
It was more one-on-one
Oh, yeah,
back then.
it was.
Well, so much of social media is its own other world that the parents and adults in general are just not part of or aware of a lot of the time. I mean, I think a lot of times we're aware in this very broad general sense, but we're not in that world. And so we don't see it or experience, and it's also, there's not the kind of the natural, policing, that's not the right word, but there's not a natural, okay, no, you can't do that, you can't talk to people that way, between the adults and the kids.
Yeah, because if we did that, back to the social media out, if you just went and talked to another student that way and it got back to your parents, man, you'd been in hot water.
Yeah.
So, it's a really good point. Safe space. Y'all heard this language, safe space? It's really common right now.
Oh, yeah.
So safe space is where anyone who felt triggered could recuperate and get help. Well, by the way, let me place some context for this quote. He is describing a university context. This is at a university campus. This is the context he's describing. On a university campus where anyone who felt triggered could recuperate and get help. The room is equipped with cookies, coloring books, bubbles, Play-Doh, calming music, pillows, blankets, and a video of frolicking puppies, as well as students and staff members purportedly trained to deal with trauma. This is on a university campus. And so, how do you reconcile that with equipping a student, if they're in a university context, when they graduate from college, they're gonna have to go to work somewhere. You hope they are. Now, are they gonna go work for a corporation? Are they gonna go to work for maybe a small business? They're gonna go to work as an educator and be a teacher. And they're supposed to function after they've been in their safe place. So that's where the whole coddling concept that these guys are trying to get across. But this is going on university campuses everywhere. And this language of safe space is becoming, it's a part of our everyday language. I need my safe space. I'm gonna go to my safe space. Maybe I need a safe space here at the office. I think I'm gonna find a safe space somewhere. Tell the rest of the staff, bye, I'm going to my safe space.
John, it's a different world.
It is.
It is a different world, and I look at that, and if it helps someone, then it helps someone.
Okay, that's another way to look at it.
You know, my son went to a university where they were averaging a suicide every semester, at least one suicide every semester.
Probably high academic would be my guess.
And his senior year, I was so happy because it wasn't gonna cost me nothing. He goes, Dad, I can't stay here anymore. I said, that's fine.
He felt the pressure.
He did. You know, if that gets someone through what they're going, I mean, we're not all wired the same. We're not. I think back to a saying that I heard not too long ago, we're all broken. That's how the light gets.
That's a good point. No, that's valid.
Way back in the early 70s, I think, two universities figured out that they started a major area of study called music therapy. And they realized, as a lot of people do, that everybody likes some kind of music. Whether it's a jingle from a commercial or you're whistling something going, you know, there's probably some kind of music. And they used it first with, it was the University of Kansas, and where I went to school at West Texas State were the two places that started, and now it's nationwide, I'm sure. But people will react and be able to bring down defenses or anxiety with certain kinds of music, and so that calming music there is very appropriate for a lot of people. It will allow them to, you know, de-escalate, I guess, and they found out with people with special needs, you know, what we used to call retarded, would be able to, where they couldn't get anything done with them, they start using the music, you know, and were able to start breaking through a little bit.
This is not a criticism, it's more of a question, I guess, and for someone like you who's more trained in psychology, I don't see anything wrong with any of those things if you're feeling triggered, but shouldn't we also by that age have some kind of, like, don't we in this room have a kind of an expectation of each other that if we're needing some of those things, that we have that acknowledgement within ourselves and we go take care of it ourselves?
Yeah,
Does that make
so
sense?
there's a fine line between teaching coping skills and this, somewhere in there, you want, and the other thing I think, we've got to teach students how to relate to each other where there's some inner independence. In other words, I'm willing to be there for you and be encouraging to you as I have the anticipation that you would be for me. That you're encouraging the cultivation of meaningful relationships, which at that age, 18, 19, even then, they're still maturing and learning how to do that.
This seems like not a very short-term thing to me, though.
Right.
Like, this is not real-world stuff.
Right.
And if they're gonna be living on their own, working a job, if they are a teacher at elementary school, well, that's a bad example, but if you're doing whatever, you don't get to stop for 2 hours a day.
Sure,
and go
sure.
do this. So you have to develop those coping mechanisms. If it's, you know, normalizing therapy, which I think everybody should go to therapy, but doing something but this is not a long-term, I think this is a Band-Aid.
So I'll use a law enforcement example. When I first started in 1990 doing chaplaincy work, the old school guys that started in the 60s, if they worked a really, really horrific, terrible, awful call, their attitude was, suck it up, buttercup. You don't need to go talk to anybody, you'll be all right, which was toxic. Now, the pendulum has gone completely the other way. Somebody works a really bad call, we're gonna send you home for the rest of the day, and we're gonna give you 2 days off before you come back. So the pendulum has swung. We've gone from, I think the old school guy was not healthy, and it did foster more suicides and other drinking and things, you know, drug abuse and things like that. But now we've gone, oh, we better send you home. So there's somewhere in the middle, there's gotta be a balance, and I'm not sure where it is. And personalities are different too. You know, different kids, some kids are so resilient, and other kids, you know, that are more tenderhearted are not. So we'll stop there. It's about where I figured we'd get, and we'll pick up there next week and see about coddling the American mind. So.
don't think, no.